ARK has been out for over a decade now with literally thousands of items added into the game. But here's the thing, over the years a lot of those items have been quietly deleted, nerfed into uselessness, or just completely forgotten about. Chances are you probably don't even remember half of them. So today we're digging up the past and covering 25 items in ARK that time left behind. First up we have Survival of the Fittest. SOTF first released back in ARK Survival Evolved, and at the time it was amazing. It was basically ARK's spin on the Hunger Games, but with dinos, supply drops, and a crazy taming system that made it feel completely different than any other battle royale. The hype was real, but it didn't last. SOTF survived about a year on ASC before it died out, mostly because the devs just didn't care. Major issues went unfixed, no new maps were added, and eventually players just moved back to the main game where there was way more content to enjoy. Before long, most people forgot it even existed. Years later, when ARK Survival Ascended launched, SOTF was revived with a new twist. It looked promising at first, a new engine, smoother systems, and a second chance at life. But that excitement didn't last either. Within a month, the game was dead again. Why? Because it was the exact same concept and style, just all over again. Players quickly realized the same problems were still there: broken hitboxes, a clunky taming system, boring, repetitive gameplay. Instead of fixing or innovating, ARK just let it rot. And that's the sad truth. Today, SOTF is fully dead. Servers went from being slot capped at launch to having literally 0 players online today. What could have been ARK's biggest side modes is now just another abandoned project. Survival of the Fittest ended up being one of those features that sounded amazing but never lived up to the hype. The devs let it rot, and eventually it was just abandoned altogether. And it wasn't the only thing left behind. Transponder nodes were also one major thing that players forgot about. Originally, they were created so that you could put a tracking device on your dino and never lose them. At first, it was a simple but really useful system, but like most things in ARK, players found a way to abuse it. Instead of just keeping track of their own creatures, people started putting transponder nodes on enemy dinos. Then they'd sit back, wait for those dinos to be walked home, and boom, the enemy base location was exposed. Entire tribes got wiped because of this. In ARK Survival Ascended, the system was removed completely and replaced with something new. Now tracking is built right into the menu. It shows up when you're just taming something, or if you just need to track a dino that you lost. It's cleaner, safer, and way more reliable. The transponder node had its perks, and for its time it worked well, but it was outdated. A revamp was long overdue, and ASA's new tracking system is one of the few changes players are genuinely happy about. However, something players weren't as happy about was the quiet removal of the compass and GPS. Both items could still be found in ASE, but with the release of ASA, they were completely removed. The compass was originally meant to help you figure out which direction that you were facing, but it didn't take long for players to realize there was an easier way. All you had to do was enable the arrow on your map. Press M, and you instantly knew which way that you were facing. It was simpler, faster, and made the compass pretty much useless. The GPS, on the other hand, was a big deal in ASE. It gave you your exact coordinates, which made finding your tribe members so much easier. For a long time it was considered a crucial item to have, but ASA's updated map system now has coordinates built directly into it, so the GPS became redundant overnight. The compass and GPS both had their time, but by the standards of ASA's new systems, they weren't really just needed anymore. Still, some players weren't too happy to see them quietly vanish after being a part of ARK for so long. The compass and GPS were items players barely used, so it's no surprise they were eventually removed, but one thing most players don't even remember at all is the berry bush seed. This item was originally added in ARK Survival Evolved at launch, but it was never actually finished. Its intended purpose was simple. It was supposed to grow a berry plant that could produce every type of berry in one place. Basically, one plant for all your berry needs. The problem? It never worked. Players couldn't even plant the seed to test it, so it just sat in the game files as an unfinished idea, and strangely enough, it's still there today. You can still spawn it in through commands, but it just doesn't do anything. And no one really knows why it was never completed or if Wildcard had bigger plans for it, but it remains one of those weird mysteries buried in ARK's history. Maybe one day we'll finally get an answer, or maybe it'll just stay as one of those forgotten, unfinished features that never saw the light of day. ARK's history is full of things that came and went. Some features lasted, others were forgotten, and some were completely replaced by better options. And speaking of better options, let me tell you about Mitra 9. Mitra 9 is a non-alcoholic supplement that quite literally makes you feel good. These drinks give you a high but without the impairment. They have a ton of great flavors, my favorite being root beer. If you're looking for a new drink to replace your coffee in the morning, Mitra is the way to go. Simply go to mitra9.com and use my code Outcast for 25% off your entire order. Now, back to the video. The berry bush seed ended up being one of those unfinished features that never went anywhere, but not everything that got added and forgotten was useless. Some things actually stood out. One of the best examples of that were the Alpha Bone helmets. These are special skins that you could place on your helmets, and they are basically a way to flex on everyone that you have taken down in Alpha Dino. You could get them from alphas like the Raptor, Rex, and even a Mosasaur. They dropped when you killed them, which meant that they weren't easy to get unless you were part of a bigger tribe that could actually farm alphas consistently. Sadly, when ASA was released, Alpha Bone helmets were removed for some odd reason. And this one actually stings a bit, because I used to wear them all the time. They gave you something unique to show off, a trophy that actually meant something. Maybe one day ARK will add them back, because right now there aren't that many skins to use. Well, unless you're paying for them, of course. Now those Alpha Bone helmets were cool trophies, but they were also kind of the thing you'd get once and then eventually forget about. And speaking of forgotten content, we have to talk about Primitive Plus. Primitive Plus was a total conversion mod for ASC that focused entirely on the primitive lifestyle. No tech, no futuristic gear, just old school survival. It introduced hundreds of new items like muskets, unique crops, and new building materials. The idea was to give players a completely different version of ARK to experience, and at first it really worked. Primitive Plus did so well that it actually won ARK's first ever mod contest back in 2016, making it the first and only true official mod in ARK Survival Evolved's history. Unfortunately, it came with a ton of problems. It was buggy, poorly optimized, and over time it stopped receiving proper updates. Slowly but surely, players abandoned it, and eventually it became just another forgotten chapter of ARK. It's still technically playable today, but barely anybody touches it anymore. What started as one of the most ambitious mods in ARK ended up being left behind. A cool idea that just never got the support that it really needed. Primitive Plus showed us just how different ARK could feel with new items and systems, but sadly it ended up being abandoned content. And that brings us to another piece of ARK's history that most players have completely forgotten, the artifact of the Flamekeeper. This was an artifact created for a fixed extinction mod, and it was actually made by the developers themselves. But here's the strange part, it never had any real in-game function. None. It could be spawned in, but it didn't really serve a purpose. To this day, it remains one of ARK's biggest mysteries. Nobody really knows what it was meant for, or why it was added in the first place. Was it supposed to tie into a scrapped boss fight, a future expansion, or was it just an experiment that never went anywhere? Sadly, the artifact of the Flamekeeper was eventually removed from the game files, so you can't even spawn it in anymore. Only a handful of true OG players even remember that it existed, making it one of the strangest pieces of lost ARK content. Artifacts are already mysterious enough, but the Flamekeeper was on another level. It never even had a real use in the main game. And speaking of strange, unused content, we can't forget one of the weirdest items ever left in ARK's files, Super Test Meat. This was a special type of meat that could instantly tame anything in the game. The catch was that it spoiled ridiculously fast, so if an admin spawned it in, you basically had to use it immediately. If you ever saw a piece of Super Test Meat in the wild, there were only two explanations. Either you spawned it in yourself, or an admin was abusing their powers. What made it so wild is that it could tame literally anything. I'm talking creatures you weren't supposed to have, like bosses. Just feed it to them, and they were instantly yours. The best guess is that back in the early days, ARK didn't have a proper force tame command coded in yet. So instead, the devs just made a weird placeholder meat as a testing tool. But for some reason, it stuck around in the files, and even today, you can still spawn it in if you really want to. Super Test Meat was one of those bizarre debug items that never really should have been in players' hands, but it still managed to leave its mark in one of ARK's strangest relics. On the other hand, the lance actually did make it into the game properly, but most survivors completely forgot that it even exists. The lance was a weapon designed for use while riding a horse. It let you joust with other players, which sounds fun in theory, but in practice it was more of a PvE gimmick. I also never saw anyone actually using it on PvP servers. And there's a reason for that. The lance doesn't really do that much damage, and compared to other weapons in the game, it's pretty useless. Most players tried it once, realized it wasn't worth the effort, and then they never touched it again. Strangely enough, you can still occasionally find lances in drops, sometimes even more often than actual loot, but for whatever reason, they've always been weirdly common in supply crates. In the end, the lance was one of those items that technically existed, but was always overlooked and forgotten. The lance was meant to bring jousting into ARK, but outside of that novelty, it ended up forgotten, blending into the long list of items players never really used. Buried into the same forgotten pile was the mysterious snow globe. This was an unobtainable item unless you played during the Winter Wonderland event back in 2016. Its main purpose was actually really unique. It gave out free copies of ARK. Sounds confusing, right? If players already had the game, how did that even work? Well, at the time, ARK used to run free weekends to encourage new players to buy the game. During these events, the promotional snow globe could either drop from a loot crate or from some dinos. When you picked one up, you had to wait out a timer until it revealed a code. That code was then redeemable for a free copy of ARK. It was a clever, unique way to pull in new players, but today, the snow globe is nothing more than a relic. It still exists in the game files, but it serves no purpose and can't be obtainable legitimately anymore. Just another piece of ARK's history that quietly disappeared. The mysterious snow globe came and went with its event, fading out of ARK entirely. The tent, on the other hand, never disappeared. It's still here today, though it doesn't really feel like it. The tent is, well, a tent. Its main purpose was to shelter you from a brutal storm on scorched earth, and back in the day, it actually saw some use. Players would set them up, close them up for the night, and then stash a few small items inside. For early scorched earth survivors, it was a handy little shelter, but today, nobody really uses it anymore. Yes, it's technically more useful than some of the other forgotten items on this list, but let's be honest, when's the last time that you actually crafted or placed one? Outside of roleplay or nostalgia, it serves almost no purpose, and most players just skip over it entirely. The tent might still be sitting in the crafting menu, largely ignored, but at least it had a purpose tied to survival. The glow stick followed a similar path. When Aberration first released, glow sticks were actually used a fair bit. Their main job was simple: light up the darkness around you. Unlike a torch though, you could actually throw them, and they'd stick to any surface for a few minutes while emitting a glow effect. On a map as dark as Aberration, they were genuinely needed back in ASE, but in ASA, they just don't feel the same anymore. The map lighting has changed, and most players don't bother with them at all. The only real niche that glow sticks found was in griefing. Since they could stick to players, people would cover enemies with them just to blind their screens in PvP. Funny, sure, but not exactly practical. Outside of that, glow sticks have pretty much just been forgotten. These days, most players just crank up their gamma settings and just skip them entirely. The glow stick was practical in its own way, but it slowly faded into the background as newer lighting options took over. The Tech ATV, on the other hand, was never really practical at all. It always felt more like a developer experiment than a true addition. Released in 2017, the Tech ATV was marketed as ARK's first car. The idea was exciting, but the physics just weren't ready. The ATV had a bizarre rollover mechanic, handled terribly on uneven ground, and felt completely out of place with the rest of the game. ARK even tried patching it once, but the fix only made it worse. Alongside the ATV, there was another forgotten vehicle, the Dune Buggy. It was basically a stripped down version of the Tech ATV, built on the same janky mechanics, and as a result, it didn't perform much better. Both of them ended up being more curiosities than actual features anyone wanted to use. Looking back, it's clear these were early experiments, tests for vehicle mechanics that would eventually show up in Extinction and later ASA. At the time, they felt random and awkward, but in hindsight, they were stepping stones towards bigger ideas, and it really makes you wonder, what other prototypes got left behind in ARK's development? The Tech ATV felt more like a tech demo than a true survival tool, something flashy that never really fits into the game. The flare gun, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Simple, functional, and designed for communication. Yet, despite being around since the early days, it's another item that quietly slipped out of most players' minds. Flare guns never had a huge purpose, which is probably why they've been forgotten. Their main use was to shoot into the air, marking your location for everybody to see. The glow could be spotted from anywhere on the map, which made it useful for teammates trying to find you. They also had one clever PvP use, countering homing missiles. If a rocket was fired at you, shooting a flare gun could confuse the missile and make it detonate before it reached its target. It was a neat trick, but not something players relied on often. Today, the flare gun is still technically in the game, but compared to everything else ARK offers, they just don't serve a major purpose. They're one of those items that had potential but slowly faded into obscurity. The flare gun had its moment as a simple way to signal allies, but like many early tools, it was one quickly overshadowed and mostly forgotten. The net gun, however, never even got the chance. Added with Genesis Part 2, the net gun was insanely overpowered. It let players rapid fire nets at enemies, completely immobilizing them. Once you were caught, you were stuck for nearly 30 seconds, which in PvP basically meant game over. There was no real counter, you were just locked down, and your fate was sealed. The devs eventually realized that they had made a huge mistake and pulled it from the game. In its place, they introduced the projectile net. This version could be loaded into the harpoon gun, fired one at a time, and included a cooldown so players couldn't just spam it endlessly. It still gave you the utility of trapping dinos and enemies, but without the chaos of the original net gun. Nets aren't available in ASA just yet, but they're expected to return with the release of Genesis Part 2, hopefully. They'll come back in their balanced form because the original net gun was simply too broken to survive. The net gun was one of those experimental weapons that actually made it into the game, but it didn't really last. It was eventually removed and reworked into the net projectile that we know today. Rocket launchers, on the other hand, had a very different journey. Believe it or not, before the primitive rocket launcher we all know, rocket launchers actually came in different tiers. You could find them as Apprentice, Journeyman, Mastercraft, and even Ascendant. And yes, they scaled. Higher tiers not only did more damage, but more importantly, they had much better durability, letting them last for much longer than the standard primitive version. As you can probably imagine, this was insanely overpowered. Having an Ascendant rocket launcher meant you could deal devastating damage without worrying about it breaking mid-raid. Players complained, and eventually the devs decided to remove them completely. Today, all we have left is the boring primitive rocket launcher. It gets the job done, but it doesn't have the same excitement or power that the old tiered versions brought to the game. The past might have been broken, but man, it was a lot more fun. Rocket launchers went from overpowered blueprints to a standardized tool of destruction, showing how even the biggest weapons in ARK can be reshaped over time. On the other end of the spectrum are items like the magnifying glass and the camera, tools that were never about firepower, but about information and creativity, yet both ended up fading into obscurity all the same. The magnifying glass was meant to be a utility tool. You could use it to check the harvestable potential of resources, or walk right up to a creature and see its health and torpor levels. On paper, that actually sounds useful, but in practice, there's almost no reason to bother with it. Most players just rely on the tame bar, spyglass mods, or the built-in tracking system instead. The camera had its own niche. It lets you take in-game photos, and the coolest feature is that you could actually use those photos to paint empty canvases for decoration. For PvE or creative players, that was fun, but when you stack it up against the rest of ARK's tools, it just didn't hold much weight. Both items had interesting ideas behind them, but ultimately, they were more novelties than essentials. And like so many other tools in ARK, they quietly slipped into the forgotten pile. The magnifying glass and camera were more about utility and novelty than survival, which is probably why they were so easily forgotten. Elevators fell into the same trap. On paper, they sound useful, great for moving up and down to high bases, but in practice, they've always been a headache. The biggest issue is the weight limit, which completely kills the point of them. If you're trying to move resources or dinos, you'll almost always run into this cap. Players quickly realized it was easier to just use grapples, zip lines, or later on, teleporters. On top of that, elevators are expensive to craft and don't really make sense in PvP setups where mobility and speed are everything. For PvE, sure, they've got the same value, but let's be honest, when's the last time that you actually saw an elevator in someone's base? They're incredibly rare these days, and for a good reason. They were a great idea at the time, but the game evolved past them, and elevators simply became obsolete. And that leads us right into another feature that had promise but didn't really stick, the tech sensor. The tech sensor was designed to detect enemies or dinos within its radius. You could set it up to control structures nearby, opening doors, triggering defenses, or activating traps depending on your configuration. On paper, it sounds like an important piece of tech. In reality though, it was way too complicated for players to bother with. It had some niche uses, like taming traps, but for PvP scenarios it just wasn't that practical. Most players ended up overlooking it entirely, and over time it became another forgotten tool of ARK's tech tier. Then we have the IED. The improvised explosive device lets you connect a string between two devices, creating a trap for unsuspecting players to walk into. In theory, it should have been terrifying, a homemade bomb just waiting to go off, but in practice, it was weak. If you were lucky, it might just kill a player, but most of the time, the damage just wasn't worth it. On top of that, players usually avoided the traps altogether, making them useless. And with so many better explosive options already in the game like C4 or rockets and later tech weapons, the IED was instantly outclassed. By the time tech rifles became common, there was really no reason to ever craft one ever again. And then we have the Mosasaur and Megalodon tech saddles. These saddles looked exciting at first, but they never really lived up to expectations. The Mosasaur tech saddle was meant to function like the Tech Wreck saddle, firing energy beams underwater. While it technically works, it's just not that great. Players still use it here and there, but underwater combat isn't as common anymore, and most people avoid building underwater bases altogether. The Megalodon tech saddle suffers even more. It's basically the same concept, just much weaker, with shorter range and far less impact. In practice, it feels pretty useless compared to other tech options. While those saddles faded into obscurity, ARK also introduced other features that sounded useful on paper but ended up being more of a novelty, like the delivery crate. The delivery crate was introduced with Extinction, and its main purpose was to let you load items into it and send them across the map to your base. It was meant to be an easier way to transfer heavy materials without making multiple trips. The problem is that on most servers, enemies can just shoot them down, which makes them practically useless in PvP. On PvE, they make a little bit more sense, but even then, if you're on a boosted server, there's literally no point in using them at all. And to top it off, they were notorious for bugging out sometimes, getting stuck in midair, or failing to fly altogether. The delivery crate ended up being more of a gimmick than a reliable tool, and speaking of features that never really stuck around, one of the strangest forgotten items was the Summon Broodmother runestone. Back in the earliest days of ARK, there weren't traditional boss fights the way that we know them today. The runestone was originally used to summon the Broodmother at any obelisk, acting as a placeholder for what would later become the tribute system. For a short time, this was the only way to actually fight her. Eventually, the runestone was removed entirely once the boss fights were integrated into terminals with artifacts and tributes. Today, it's just another piece of ARK's history, something that you can no longer access outside of old files. But the runestone wasn't the only strange relic hidden in ARK's past. There's also one of the weirdest items ever discovered in the game files, the mysterious cube. The cube was a promotional item that would spoil into a reveal cube after a few hours. Once it did, it rewarded you with a Steam code for a 50% discount on ARK. It was very similar to the mysterious snow globe, but with the same goal of pulling more players into the game. You could find these cubes in supply drops or even as rare loot from killing dinos. It was a clever idea, but like many other promotional items, it eventually disappeared from circulation. Today, the mysterious cube still exists in the game files, but it's completely forgotten. And speaking of forgotten oddities, there's another relic buried in ARK Survival Evolved: deformed characters. Back in ASC, the character creation menu allowed you to make some of the wildest, most ridiculous looking survivors you'd ever see in a video game. From comically tiny legs to giant stretched out torsos, it was an iconic part of ARK's early charm. But when ASA launched, that freedom was quietly taken away. Character customization was toned down, and most players now look fairly normal by default. It's sad to see such an iconic piece of ARK's history gone. And the truth is, a lot of players probably didn't even notice until now. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like this feature is ever coming back, and the only way to experience those bizarre creations today is to go back and play ASE. And that's the thing about ARK, it's packed with strange items, forgotten mechanics, and features that came and went without players even noticing. From powerful weapons that were too broken to last, to silly cosmetics and abandoned experiments. These pieces of ARK's history tell a story of a game that was always evolving, for better or worse. So whether you missed those features or you're just learning about them for the first time, one thing's for sure, ARK's history is just as wild as the game itself.